Hi guys, so in today's video we're going to be talking about placement preparation, and I can't believe I've actually never done a video explaining to you guys what's involved in placement. I know I've done a few vlogs on it which will be linked in the description box, but I've actually never done a video telling you guys the ins and outs and how to start and how to handle it and everything that's involved. So in this video, I'm going to go over placement applications, the interview process, admin and your first session, and leaving placement. And I'm going to end with some extra information for you to take away. And I also have another video on placement stress if you'd like to watch that after. It will also be linked at the end of this video and in the description box. So let's get into it. So let's start with placement applications. Like I said before, if you watched the video I did on placement stress, you'll know that the application process can be very exhausting, can be very tiring, and just overwhelming in general. So I'm going to try and give you as much guidance as possible to make it easier for you so you know what to expect when you start. This video is going to be for everybody who's doing level 4 counselling skills and above. But you can also watch this if you're doing level 3 or level 2 just to get ahead of the game, because you can never be too prepared. Now, the reason that I think it takes so long for our applications to go through is because counselling organisations in general and companies are just swamped and usually quite understaffed. And of course, as we know, there's a very high demand for counsellors and therapists at this moment in time. Everybody wants a therapist. Everybody's looking for a therapist, especially the organisations that offer free therapy or reduced prices. They are the ones that are the most swamped, and they're the ones that sometimes will usually take on trainees. So it's very hard for them to process a lot of applications, not only processing the client applications but also processing trainee applications. And to be quite honest, usually the trainees are the bottom of the priority list, so that means our applications will usually take the longest to be responded to. This is not to say all placements are like that, but give yourself at least 2 to 3 months to apply from the time that you would like to begin your placement. So if you want to start your placement in September, I would suggest start looking and applying for placements in July. But like I said, this is not all placements. I was fortunate enough to get my first placement within like a week, and I didn't even have to do an interview. It was a school, so they just asked me to come in and, ask me how many hours I wanted, how many clients I wanted, and so on and so forth, and that was it. But some of my other placements have taken a bit longer, which I'll speak a bit more about later in the video. So I was fortunate in that sense, but I think it also depends on the hiring manager or the people who are in charge of the hiring process. Some might be counselors, some might be supervisors, some will be specifically in the role of hiring. So it depends on what they're doing and how many roles they play in the organization. That will also determine how long it takes for them to get back to you. The placement that I'm starting in January took about 2 months from the point of me emailing them and being accepted onto the placement, but now I have to wait until January 8th to hear back from him because he's on holiday and I won't be able to start until he gets back to me. So now it's going to be like 3 months. So you just keep some things in mind, because yes, therapists and counsellors will go on holiday for a long period of time sometimes, or life happens and somebody else will have to take over. So just keep that in mind. The sooner you apply, the better. So in all honesty, the reason mine took a bit long, 2 months plus, and now heading on to 3 months, is because I had to get a lot of paperwork that they required and I didn't have some of the paperwork. So to speed up the application process, I recommend that you have all your documents ready. You might not be asked for all of them, but just have them ready anyway, so that if you're asked for them, you're just getting them from your laptop or your computer and you're not having to get them from scratch, which some of the stuff I had to get from scratch because I didn't have them. So some of the things you need to make sure you have, of course, is identification. So this could be a passport or driver's license. Make sure you have your DBS, make sure you have references that are ready, make sure you have your insurance and have your proof that you're a member of a governing body, and an ICO certificate, which I don't fully understand and know what that is, but my recent placement asked me for that one. The school only asked me for I think my DBS, identification and something else which I can't remember, but they didn't ask for a lot. So it just depends and it varies from placement to placement. And also don't forget, if you have documents that you need them to sign, make sure you have those ready so that as they're taking your information, you also get them to sign everything that you need them to sign, whether that's via email or face-to-face. I know that my university asks me to get my placement to fill in 3 different forms or 2 different forms. It's my responsibility to make sure that my placement signs that and I can give it back to the university. So ensure that you have your stuff ready as well and that they return it to you in a timely manner, especially if you've got deadlines. The interview process Now, this can be quite nerve-wracking, as of course interviews naturally are. I already did a video on the master's interview process, which you can watch and will be tagged in the description box as well, but that was a bit more challenging than the placement interviews, so let's get into that. So first of all, each placement will have a different type of interview process, of course. Some will be online, some will be in person. So I've had one in person, I've had 2 online, and the school didn't even give me an interview. Like I said, they just accepted me via email and they were like, yeah, come in and see the school, let's sign paperwork and let's get started. So it just depends. But all the other placements where I've had interviews, they had a variety of different questions, and I'm going to share some of the questions I had from what I can remember and some of the questions that my colleagues had as well, so that you get an idea of what kind of things you might expect. Of course, this doesn't exhaust every kind of question you could get, but it also doesn't mean you're going to get all of these questions. So weirdly enough, I've heard that some of them have asked them to write like a whole essay, like 1,000 words, 2,000 words. I feel like it's very extravagant, very unnecessary, but I don't know what their reasoning for that is. So some placements might ask you to write a small essay, a big essay. That might be the case, and I'm not sure. I think the essay will probably be based on a case study that they give you, or it might be about you as a trainee. I'm not quite sure. Some placements might give you a case study or a scenario, which you then have to explain what you would do in that scenario. And similarly, you might be presented with an ethical scenario, which you have to describe how you would handle it, and it's probably best to reference the BACP ethical framework. Take something from there, don't just make something up. Use the BACP ethical framework to show that you have your understanding of the ethical framework, which is really, really important. Another thing that might come up is that you have to explain and know your strengths and weaknesses in clinical practice. You have to be able to explain that you have self-awareness. This goes hand in hand with showing that you're self-aware, so you're able to speak about what you're really good at and what you need to improve on and what you need to work on. And it's not just from your own observation. This could be stuff that your supervisors have said, it could be stuff that you've heard from your clients. So take all of that into consideration so that it shows that you're able to take feedback from other people and that you also are self-aware enough to recognize things within yourself without other people having to tell you. So try and bring examples from different people, not just yourself, if you can, because that will look really good in the interview. Another thing that might happen is you might be asked to do a role play as a counselor. So whoever's doing the interview or somebody else in the interview might take on the role of a client, and then they'll speak and say something, and then you have to respond as the counselor, of course. So that could vary. Sometimes it might be about 10 minutes. I don't think they would ever exceed 20 or 30 minutes, but I think most times it might be like 10 or 15 minutes, maybe even less. So be prepared for that as well. Other questions that my colleagues have been asked are things like, what is your understanding of diversity and equal opportunities? What is your understanding of confidentiality? And in this question, you have to, of course, reference the BCP ethical framework, and you have to show that you understand the circumstances under which confidentiality can be broken. You have to be able to know these off by heart. There's 4 of them, and if you don't know them, get to know them. Another question that my colleague had was, who is the most discriminated in society and what impact might this have on them? A kind of ethical scenario that somebody was given is, if a young person disclosed that they'd been sexually assaulted and asked me to keep it a secret, what would I do? So that one, you also have to think ethically, and you can't just say like what you would do in everyday life. That's very different to what you do as a counsellor. Another question is, what challenges have I experienced? What did I do and what did I learn from them? You will feel nervous, it's normal, but honestly, good luck. You will be absolutely fine. Just be ready for certain questions, especially understanding yourself, knowing the ethical framework, and maybe being prepared for role play. Those are the most common things that are likely to come up in a counselling placement interview. Okay, now let's move on to the admin and your first session, because now you've aced your interview, so let's prepare for your first session. So first and foremost, once you've been accepted onto your placement, chances are they will probably give you a bunch of policies and things to read and to sign. So make sure you read and understand the organization's policies for health and safety, breaking confidentiality, how to handle maybe a client disclosing certain things, what to do when a client presents a high risk, things like that. They'll give you all of those things, so make sure you read them and you understand them so that at least you can explain them in summary to the client should you need to, which I'll get get onto in a second. And sometimes it can feel overwhelming. Even if you don't remember everything off by heart, don't beat yourself up. It's a lot of information to take in, but there are certain things that you have to know and you should be prepared for. But of course, you could write down a summary of the things that you'd want to give to your client, so your client has a copy of the contract. Of course, your client should already have a copy of the contract, but if they don't, you could give that to them if the organization is okay with that. Because you're a trainee, you also won't be expected to do client assessments. There will be somebody in the organization or the company who is specially trained to do client assessments. You'll just be allocated a client and you'll be given the information that was handed over in the assessment, which was done before the client started therapy. So you can read that to get a better understanding of the client and just be prepared for what to talk about. However, this doesn't mean that in your first session you do absolutely nothing. You kind of have to do a mini unofficial assessment of some sort where you're kind of just gathering information, but nothing extreme, nothing overwhelming. It's just a simple understanding of maybe their level of risk or certain things which might not have been in the assessment. So in your first session with a client, start with the admin. That's what I'd recommend. Do the admin stuff at the start. Introduce yourself, say who you are and maybe how long you'll be working together. If it's open-ended, say, we'll be working together for the foreseeable future. If maybe it's a 3-month or 6-week sessions, specify that so that they know and there's no confusion. And then that way you can at least maybe talk about what you'd like to do in each session, especially if it's short-term therapy, maybe 6 weeks. It'll be good to talk about the kind of things that you want to achieve in those 6 sessions so that you can make the best of your time together. So normally I spend about 10-15 minutes of the session just going over the admin stuff. It shouldn't be too overwhelming. It can take a bit longer, it can take a bit less. It just depends. Maybe if your client has a lot of questions, it might take a bit longer. Some clients might have had therapy before, so they might not want to hear all the jargon and the introductions again. It just depends. The next thing I do after introducing myself and going over how long we're going to be working together, if I have documents for them to sign, this will be the time to also do that. I explain confidentiality, I'll explain boundaries and things like that, and I'll explain maybe cancellation and rescheduling policies if it's not clear or if they don't know, and maybe payments and how often payments should be made and so on and so forth. And once you're done with this, be sure to ask them if they have any questions, and if they don't have anything, just let them know that they can email you or text you if they have any questions later that they remember. I've also recently started letting clients know that if they have any issues with me, they can raise them with me, and if they are not comfortable doing so within the session, that they can always email me after the session and let me know if I've done something or said something to make them feel uncomfortable, because oftentimes I think clients can just feel a bit intimidated to be head-on and direct, especially because you might be perceived as somebody who's more knowledgeable or in a position of power. So I think it's also nice to just let them know that if you are in the wrong or you've offended them in some way, that they can meet you and they can explain it to you via email or via text. So once the admin is out of the way, normally I'll start with what's brought you to therapy and have you had therapy before. And I think it's always a good idea to kind of find out how their previous therapy went if they want to, because of course if they've had a terrible experience with therapy before, they might not want to talk about it. But I think it's just good to get an insight into maybe what went wrong or what they didn't like, so that you can make adjustments for them and at least they can feel open about it, and you can also see where they're coming from. So normally, like I said, I'll ask them what's brought them to therapy, or I might say like, where would you like to start? I've seen your assessment, where would you like to begin? And sometimes they might say they don't know, so you can just start with something in the assessment, or you can ask them how their week was or how their day was and work your way from there, because some people might feel like, although I'm ready to be here, I don't know what to start talking about because you're a complete stranger to me, although they have things on their mind. So that will be important. So even in that, actually, once you've asked them like what's brought them to therapy, I think it's also important to ask them what their therapeutic goals are. Do they have any goals for therapy? What would they like to achieve in therapy? It's important to ask them that. And sometimes clients might not have therapeutic goals, and that's absolutely fine. If you have reviews, let them know that there might be a review at some point and bring that up so that they're a bit aware. And if they don't know what the review is, explain it to them briefly as well. So normally within that first session, once we get to the end, I like to leave a few minutes just to ask how they found the first session and what they thought, and also find out if they're happy to proceed and come back again the following week. You might remain on the same time every week. Sometimes it might be just going as per week. So be sure to make that clear as well. So once you've been at your placement, how do you now leave your placement? Now, most placements will usually state how long their contract with you is, and the norm is usually 6 months, 1 year, or 2 years. But of course, life happens, and sometimes you might not be able to keep to that. So that's fine. I'm sure organizations understand that, and they're open-minded to you having to finish or cut your contract early if you really have to. Whatever your circumstances are, try and check your notice period so that you know when to hand in your notice should you need to leave or should you need to stop your therapy. So for example, the one I'm doing at the moment online is a 3-month notice, so I have to let them know 3 months ahead that I'm going to be finishing soon, and I will obviously let my clients know that our time will be coming to an end in a few months. So just make sure you do that so that you end on good terms with your placement. Also, I advise that you ask for references as soon as you leave, even if you don't need them immediately. But I think it's actually quite helpful to do that, because when you're there, your supervisor will be the best person to ask for a reference, hopefully, unless the organization says otherwise, because you'll still be fresh in their mind. They'll still remember you, and they'll still remember what you were doing and the kind of person you are and how you approach things. So if you ask them to write a reference straight away, you can just keep it for future when you need it, when you're applying for jobs or whatever else, or another placement. That'll be really helpful instead of waiting maybe like 6 months later or a year later and going back to them and asking for that reference. I think as soon as you finish your placement, ask for the reference and just keep it with you. So let's just talk about some extra things to note regarding placement before we get to the end of this video. So it's important to ask your placement if you're allowed to record sessions. I know back in the day, client sessions were not recorded, I think, but it depends. Some institutions don't require you to record, but if your institution does require you to record, ensure you ask your placement if you're allowed to record. But ultimately, the decision is always up to the client. So even if your placement says yes, your client can still say no, and you have to be okay with that. And of course, there's a predicament behind that, because you're going to need some of those recordings for your assessments in uni. But at the same time, you could also ask your placement to try and allocate you people who are okay with the recording, so the placement can ask on your behalf before allocating you a client. Another thing, have an organized way of storing all your notes and all your documents, because there's going to be an awful lot of documents. So at the moment, I write notes for myself on the detailed notes in my notebook. And then my uni has 2 forms that they like me to fill out. So client hours and a summary of the client session. And then my placement also has another document for me to fill out. And it's like just a lot. Some placements won't, but it's just a lot. So right now I have like a lot of things to write after a session with each client. I'm not just filling in 1 set of notes, I'm filling in 3 different sets of notes. So keep everything organized, know where everything is, and try and have a backup copy of everything. It's unlikely, but I've heard some placements might ask you to handle payments. One of my colleagues, her placement asked her to handle payments. I don't really fully understand how, but that might be something that you might need to do. But like I said, it's very unlikely. So just keep that one in mind. You might want to keep a placement journal. This is something that I started when I was in my first placement. I was just processing my experience with clients and what I've learned and what went well, what went wrong, and things that I picked up and things that I noticed within myself, simply because I want to be able to look back in a few years and just look at where I started and maybe just have things that will help me in the future. This is not mandatory, but I think it's a good idea. And I'm not gonna lie, I haven't written in mine in a long time, a long few months, more than 6 months for sure, and I'm meaning to update it because I want to look back at the time when I was starting out and see my progress and see things that I learned, and maybe even go back to things where I can refer to that will help me in the future when I have certain clients who remind me of other clients. Another thing is, make sure you ask about supervision. Ask whether it's going to be group or one-to-one, whether it's going to be paid or unpaid. And most likely it will be fortnightly, so you don't have to worry about that. But I'm sure this will probably would have already come up at some point in your interview process or something like that. So don't worry about that too much. But just in case they're not explicit about it, it's always good to ask, because some people's supervision is paid and some is unpaid. And you need to obviously know exactly how much you're going to be paying and how many people in a group as well, because your university might say that if there's 4 people in a group, you can only count maybe half an hour of that session. You can't count 1 hour. So be sure to calculate that as well if it's important for your university to know. Your institution might have places for you to pick placements from. Some might ask you to go out there and just look by yourself. My university gave me a database which has about 200 to 300 placement providers on there. So it just varies across institutions. Some might be a bit more supportive, some might not be, but either way, utilize what your university or your institution has. If you're able to do at least 2 placements, please do so. This is not mandatory, of course. If you're only doing 1 year and you only need like 50 hours or something, or just 60 hours, then of course that might not be feasible. But if you're doing like a longer extended placement, maybe for 2 years or 3 years, then try and do 2 or more placements, just so you can widen your horizons and you can increase your chances of getting employed, because you'll have different experience in different areas. So for me, even though it wasn't intentional, I have a good range of experience. So I've worked in a school with kids 16 to 18. My current placement is online with adults, and my next placement is going to be with adults face-to-face and short-term therapy with only 6 sessions. So I've got a wide range of experience doing long-term therapy, short-term therapy, working with high-risk clients, low-risk clients, online and face-to-face. So try and do as much as you can. It can be overwhelming. I wouldn't recommend it, but I think at least 2 placements, because I've done 3 across 2 years, and that's a lot. Well, I'm going to do 3 because I'm starting the other one in January. But my point is, the more that you have, the better it is, and it allows you to be able to apply for more jobs. But if you know that you specifically want to work just online or just face-to-face, or you only want to do short-term therapy, then of course you don't need to try and get different experience in different areas or different types of therapy. You can just stick to the one that you want to do and specialize in and stick to that. So I hope that helps. Like I said, if you'd like to know more about placement stuff, I have another video on placement stress, which you can watch next, and I'll see you in that video. Bye.